Wasteland 2 nails the basics, but plays things a little too safe to become a genre classic like its predecessor. That's fine though, not every game needs to be a classic, and being very good is more than enough for me, especially when you consider the state of a certain other post-apocalyptic RPG franchise that I won't mention. Actually, I will mention it a lot, I don't know why I said that. It's Fallout. For starters, Wasteland 2 provides a wonderful reminder that post-apocalyptic wastelands are not fun places to live in, and that perhaps nuclear weapons are bad actually. Combat isn't as deep as it could be, but it's fun, and I only started to get bored of it near the end of my 60-hour playthrough. There are nearly always multiple ways to resolve quests, and you have complete freedom to help and hinder whomever you want. The main story isn't spectacular, but the smaller stories you stumble across on your way are more than enough to make up for it. What I found most impressive was that despite being the sequel to a game that was 26 years old at the time of release, Wasteland 2 builds extensively on that original game to create a world that is much more fleshed out than you'd expect. I won't go as far as to say you need to play Wasteland 1 before Wasteland 2, but it's certainly rewarding if you do. As such, to look at the making of Wasteland 2, we really need to go all the way back to Wasteland 1. The original Wasteland was the brainchild of Brian Fargo of Interplay Productions, who wanted to make an RPG along the lines of Ultima and Bard's Tale, but with a post-apocalyptic setting instead of a fantasy one. Fargo worked on the Bard's Tale too, so he had experience with the genre. There's conflicting information on how long the game took to develop. In recent interviews, Fargo has stated it took 5 years to make, which while common for big games nowadays would have been incredibly unusual back then. In more contemporaneous interviews and the manual itself, Fargo said Wasteland took around 2 years to develop, which sounds more likely. A 5-year cycle meant development would have started around 1983 when the video game market crashed. Perhaps some ideas were being thrown around and then shelved for a few years, or Fargo worked on it part-time for a bit before the entire team at Interplay started work. As was often the case, one of the major development issues was simply working with the limited amount of space available on the disc, or discs in this case as it came on too. Players needed to make backups of those discs because Wasteland was one of the first games to have a persistent world that changed depending on your actions. Most computers didn't have hard drives, so there was limited space to save changes. Wasteland updated the information on the disk every time you went to a new location, hence you were expected to run the game off copies after using the original to boot the game. Obviously we are now used to worlds being updated as we play, so it's tempting to say Wasteland was ahead of its time here. However, the persistent world had a few quirks and wasn't that popular with players. The best explanation of the problems I found was actually in relation to the quasi-sequel to Wasteland, Fountain of Dreams, but the system worked in much the same way in both games. There's a moment in Fountain of Dreams where you're captured, surrender all your weapons and enter a new area. The game saves the changes to your inventory because you entered a new area. Now say you were to load up an old save, perhaps because you realised you'd made a mistake or simply had to quit out of the game. You boot back to the point before being captured, however the game still remembers you surrendered your guns so you don't have them anymore. With the game actively encouraging you to make copies, there obviously needed to be a robust copy protection system in place, and that's where the manual comes in. The back of the manual effectively contained the game's story, plus passwords and key bits of information you needed to progress. At specific points while playing, the game would tell you to read certain paragraphs instead of displaying the text on screen. In addition to story, these paragraphs contained key codes and passwords, so if you didn't have the manual you were out of luck. This probably sounds like a horrendous user experience for legitimate players, but the story had to be included separately in a physical manual anyway because there wasn't enough room for it on those discs. Strangely, there was also some platform exclusive content of sorts, although it was even more useless than most platform exclusive content is now. The IBM PC version of the game contained a unique skill option called combat shooting that you could only select during character creation. Weirdly, it doesn't do anything. According to Brian Fargo, the skill was at one point used in the formula to determine accuracy and was presumably left in by mistake. Wasteland released in 1988 on the Apple II, Commodore 64 and IBM PCs. Wasteland reviewed well and picked up a few awards, and I think it sold respectably too, although I'm not sure what the final number was. I know it sold at least 250,000, which wasn't bad in those days. I'm sure the publisher, a then fledgling Electronic Arts, would have been happy enough with the sales. Happy enough to commission a sequel, sort of. EA opted to develop what came to be known as Fountain of Dreams in-house, using a completely different team and a new engine. The setting was similar in that it was post-apocalyptic, albeit set in Florida instead of Arizona. However, there was no attempt to continue the story of the first game. Late in development, EA decided to market it as a completely new series, hence the name Fountain of Dreams instead of Wasteland 2. Despite the late attempt to separate Fountain of Dreams from Wasteland, there was no escaping the connection due to the similar look and brutally tough start, plus the fact that post-apocalyptic RPGs were still rare. Critics and fans went into the game expecting something at least vaguely similar in quality to Wasteland and were sorely disappointed. A review in Computer Gaming World magazine describes it as incorporating all the worst features of Wasteland and none of the good. The reviewer noted that the best thing about the game was how quickly it loaded up, and remarked on the lack of copy protection before adding that a game this bad probably doesn't need any. Talk about being damned with faint praise. During all this, the team at Interplay worked on a game called Meantime that would have taken place in the Wasteland universe and with the same engine, although it would not have continued Wasteland's story. Meantime was abandoned as the 8-bit era came to a close, presumably because it would have been too technologically out of date by the time it released. Even Wasteland was a bit dated in 1988. As you'll know if you watched the very first episode in this video series on the history of isometric CRPGs, we nearly got a sequel to Wasteland in the late 90s. Fergus Urquhart and Tim Cain wanted to make a sequel to Wasteland while at Interplay, however EA still held the rights and didn't want to license them out. Soon after this, EA sold the IP to Konami. Fallout has a lot in common with Wasteland, way beyond being another CRPG with a post-apocalyptic setting and turn-based combat. Among other things, Fallout used a similar tagline in its original title, calling itself a post-nuclear role-playing game compared to Wasteland's Adventure in Post-Nuclear America tag. The world in Fallout is referred to as the Wasteland. You go to farming communities early on in both games. There are religious groups worshipping nuclear power. A group called the Guardians in Wasteland is a lot like the Brotherhood in Fallout. The main story is about replacing humans with a new species, robots or mutants, and both have storylines with gangs controlling cities and you're asked to kill the other leader. Hell, one of the first missions in Wasteland is to repair a water pump. Later Fallout games continue to tip their hats to Wasteland, whether deliberate or not, with Fallout New Vegas including a group called the Desert Rangers, the very people you play as in Wasteland. Mind you, both groups were likely influenced by the real Arizona Rangers. Fallout of course went on to become a huge success, spawning sequels and spin-offs, and Wasteland looked destined to remain a game that only older gamers and hardcore Fallout fans knew about, until Kickstarter. The crowdfunding platform played a huge role in the resurgence of isometric CRPGs over the last decade, helping fund Shadowrun Returns and Divinity Original Sin. Kickstarter's impact on these games is sometimes overstated, as was the case with Divinity Original Sin, which was largely complete before Larian launched its campaign. However, it's fair to say that Wasteland 2 might never have been made without Kickstarter. Brian Fargo, via his new company inXile Entertainment, acquired the Wasteland IP way back in 2003 after Konami let it lapse. In the 9 years prior to the launch of the Kickstarter campaign, there were a few hints at a new Wasteland title, and some concept art appeared online, but that was it. The Kickstarter campaign states emphatically that it is probably the last chance for a Wasteland sequel. inXile Entertainment calculated that it needed $1 million to make Wasteland 2. Brian Fargo agreed to kick in $100,000 of his own money, which left a shortfall of $900,000, which was the target for the Kickstarter campaign. The campaign blew through its goal and ended up receiving over $3 million in fan funding. Not bad for a sequel to a game from 1988. Actually, it's worth emphasising just how remarkable an achievement this was and what it says about that original Wasteland game, because not only did inXile use the Wasteland name to raise money, it went as far as making Wasteland 2 a true sequel that carried on the events of the first game, and included many of the same characters in prominent roles. I know that probably sounds like an obvious thing to do in a sequel, but it wasn't common back then, especially with story-heavy RPGs. Fallout 1 and 2 were released only 12 months apart, and yet they ignored most of what happened before to let new players start with a blank slate. I would have forgiven inXile for doing something similar given the 26-year gap. Let's put it in context a bit. Wasteland released in 1988 during the third generation of gaming. Wasteland 2 released in the 8th generation. To emphasise the difference, the 64 in Commodore 64 stood for 64 kilobytes of RAM. In the late 80s, video games genuinely were a niche hobby. We still tend to treat them as if they are and get defensive about attacks on gamers and that sort of nonsense, but back in the late 80s there genuinely was a stigma attached to playing games. Not only that, systems like the Apple II and Commodore 64 were a sort of niche within a niche. The Apple II had been around for a while, but it would still set you back over $1,000 in 1988, so we're talking about $4,000 or $5,000 US in today's money. The Commodore 64 cost $600, so around $1,500 in 2020. The landscape for gaming changed a lot between 1988 and 1997, which partly explains why Wasteland never became the pop culture behemoth that Fallout did, despite influencing those games. Even me, as old as I undeniably am, did not play Wasteland until recently. As a 6-year-old kid, my only experience of games at that time was dabbling with the likes of Mario and Alex Kidd on friends and family systems, and randomly some golf games on what I think was my nan's brother's ZX Spectrum. Wasteland 2 wasn't even playable on modern PCs until inXile ported it as part of the Kickstarter campaign while making a few tweaks, such as a more modern save system, new resolutions and the inclusion of the strategy guide that was originally a separate purchase. With all that in mind, imagine you're in charge of making a sequel to Wasteland. You want it to be a sequel because there is some name recognition there, even though weirdly much of that is due to the success of another IP. The temptation to either completely ignore or at least downplay the events of the old game would be huge. If it were me, I'd be inclined to throw in a few Easter eggs for fans of the original and then start from scratch. However, much to their credit, that is not what Brian Fargo and his team at inXile Entertainment did. Wasteland 2 builds strongly on what came before and expects you to either know about Wasteland 1 or go to the effort of getting caught up through the information given to you in-game. You even have characters from small side quests in Wasteland 1 playing a key role in the sequel. The fact that the first game wasn't ignored in the sequel speaks to how highly fans revere the original game. Wasteland had its critics, it wasn't universally well received, and bear in mind that those playing and reviewing the game in the first place were intense genre fans. This wasn't in an era where you could watch someone else play the game on Twitch for 5 minutes and then go leave a user review of 1 out of 10 on Metacritic because a female character had blue hair or whatever. Wasteland only appealed to a small crowd and not all of them loved it. Still, those who enjoyed Wasteland really enjoyed Wasteland and it stuck with them, enough that inXile rewarded them with a proper sequel 26 years later. Wasteland 2 generated around 350,000 sales in the first 6 months of release, and that's before console ports and the director's cut. I can't find a current sales total, but as of 2016 it had made around $12 million for inXile. Presumably that includes the Kickstarter money. Wasteland 2 did well with critics, with scores generally falling in the 8 out of 10 range. Most critics knocked the game down a bit for the amount of bugs and a rough user interface, which was largely fixed with the director's cut, a free update that coincided with the release of the ports for the PS4 and Xbox One. The UI is a lot better now, and most bugs have been fixed. In fact, my entire playthrough was bug-free, believe it or not. Loads of new spoken dialogue was added, and while not every line is spoken, most of them are, and the voice acting is strong. It's interesting to note that the enhanced edition to Divinity Original Sin added lots of voice acting as well. Presumably the games didn't have the budget for it during the main development phase, and then they used the money that came in from sales to pay voice actors. Visually, the director's cut looks and performs better thanks to the switch to Unity 5 from Unity 4.5. There are also new perks and the addition of precision strikes, which functions a bit like VATS in the early Fallout games. Believe it or not, we aren't done yet, because in February 2020, inXile released a remake of the original Wasteland. Developed by Chrome Studios, the remake vastly improves the user experience from the original, while keeping the game much the same, sometimes to its detriment as we'll see shortly. There are 3D models, voice acting, and all those paragraphs of text that you used to have to look up in a manual are of course now included in the game, along with a system for keeping track of passwords you've discovered. The remake even keeps some of the odd quirks from the original. For example, even though most bugs have been fixed, the developers left in a well-known glitch that effectively nets you infinite XP. While in courts, if you move between 2 houses, you can access a secret alley, get onto the roof and look down on some enemies. Not literally, you can't actually see them, but the game tells you they are there and this rewards you perception points. If you stay here long enough, preferably by holding down the escape key to make time move faster, you'll keep getting more and more XP. Also, the original had this weird thing where it said you were fighting mutant bunnies but showed pictures of rats, presumably due to space limitations. The remaster keeps that in. If you are interested in playing the original Wasteland, I recommend playing the remake because it really is the same game with just a few edges shaved off. Wasteland takes place 100 years after the world is devastated by a nuclear war between the US and Russia that started in 1998. You play as a group of desert rangers in the region around Nevada, Arizona and California, who see themselves as a sort of peacekeeping unit tasked with responding to distress calls in the area. The Desert Rangers started off as a group of US Army engineers who happened to be in the desert when the war kicked off. They took over the prison and expelled the inmates to what was almost certain death, perhaps not the most noble of origin stories. Wasteland starts simply by sending you out into the wasteland to help people. There's a default group of 4 named characters, although you can create your own. I had a couple of false starts thanks to poor character design on my part, or simply not noticing that all your characters must have a canteen on them when navigating the wasteland or they die of thirst. If I had played this back in 1988, even if I'd been a bit older, I would have definitely needed the strategy guide, which kind of talks you through the game, giving you small and not so small hints at what to do next and how. It's even written in the form of a story of the Wasteland experience, which is quite cool. Wasteland is an incredibly tough game, especially the original version, so if I can give one piece of advice for creating your characters, it would be to focus on the intelligence attribute. You can't pick your attributes as such, but you can re-roll as much as you like, so keep doing that until you get something decent. Intelligence is crucial because it dictates how many skill points you get and what skills you have access to. And the skills themselves are so important that nearly every time the game gave me more attribute points, I shoved them into intelligence. Actually, this over-reliance on intelligence might be another thing Fallout copied from Wasteland. The skill list is massive and way too specific. As such, I found it overwhelming and confusing. You have separate skills for different types of weapon, perception, picking locks and medic, which is simple enough, although even some of these are presented in a confusing manner. For example, there are separate skills for brawling and pugilism, even though both are for hand-to-hand combat. There are also a lot of very specific skills that no new player is going to understand the importance of right off the bat. Bureaucracy is for talking to bureaucrats. Acrobat is for, well, performing acrobatic stunts, whatever the hell that entails in a post-apocalyptic RPG. Forgery is for recognising fake documents. Is that something to worry about? I coped without it, although presumably there is a use for it somewhere. Given a choice between dumping skill points into my weapon of choice or detecting someone's fake passport, I'll go with the weapon. Wasteland is heavy on combat, which is turn-based with random encounters. This can be pretty tedious. At best, you just select attack for everyone in your party, but you might have to select attack, then the shot type, then who you're aiming at, and then repeat again and again. The whole thing is a chore, even with improvements in the remake. In the original, you had to use an awkward mix of numbers and letters, so you might have to press A to attack and then 1 to choose to attack Harry. The remake does it all by numbers, which is a lot easier, although still tedious. You can actually set up macros if you want to automate all this, however I was constantly switching up my party, weapons and the types of shots they took, so that seemed like more hassle than it was worth. But yeah, the fact that you can set up macros probably says a lot about the quality of the system here. The main problem with combat though is how limited your options are and how little information you have. The extent of the tactical depth on offer is whether to run or fight, or to use single fire mode or burst fire mode. There's little information about the weapons, so you won't necessarily know if you're equipping an assault rifle or a normal rifle, which is important because they're attached to different skills. You can't accurately gauge how close you are to enemies after the fight starts either, unless there are multiple enemy groups to aim at, because then you are presented with the information each time you take a shot. The models you see on screen aren't representative of how close the enemies are, so you could miss all your shots because they're too far away or around a corner, even though you've moved to within 1 square of them. You don't know how much HP enemies have, so there's no way to know how close they are to death. In 99% of fights you just move through the motions, shooting at whatever is closest and then moving on to the next group. The combat problem is amplified by how much there is of it and the constant unavoidable random encounters. Enemies are in nearly every area of the game, even if it makes no sense story-wise. One town had the typical deal with the raiders style quest, so I did. I killed all the raiders in the town, including the leader, and completed the quest. Except they continue to ambush me in the town. The combat goes from annoying to unbearable in the final act, when all the major areas are effectively long dungeons that you have to trawl through, fighting enemy after enemy with little in the way of break. I nearly broke in the Las Vegas sewers when there was a significant difficulty spike and lots of fights against robots. I eventually got to what I thought was the end, only to find that I had to grind more encounters because I needed a specific number of robot parts and I didn't even have half of what I needed. The subsequent levels are just as bad, if not worse. You can usually leave to stock up on ammo and health and then come back, but to do that you need to fight your way back through more random encounters. Eventually I got so fed up I had to stop and I never did finish the last couple of missions. The first half of the game strikes a better balance between combat and exploration. The early game feels a bit more like a point-and-click adventure than a typical RPG. Most problems have a strong puzzle element, and while you're not quite pixel hunting, you do need to do the right thing in exactly the right place, like using perception to spot an entrance to a cave between two trees, or using a rope to cross water. Sometimes playing the remaster made this stuff more obvious thanks to all the extra detail, but other times it actually had the opposite effect. For example, when you're in a bar you need to take note of a passcode written on a table. In the remaster I mistook this for some light environmental storytelling and didn't pay much notice to it. In the original the passcode is only mentioned in the dialogue box, and it's hard to miss because that's where most of your attention is. In the remake you aren't really bothering with the dialogue box and you aren't generally relying on it for clues, so the same information is much easier to miss. Wasteland offers options for how to complete quests. I know we take this sort of thing for granted now, but having a choice between getting a key to a door, lockpicking it, or simply blowing it open was quite a big deal in the late 80s. Likewise, you have freedom in who you help and who you kill. If you want, you can make life very difficult for yourself by attacking anyone who looks at you a bit funny. There is a decent amount of freedom, and I can certainly see why that would have been appealing 30 years ago. While most of the puzzles are fairly straightforward, Wasteland's interface has a habit of getting in the way and making things more complicated than they need to be. Early on you have to hand over a credit card to a man in a bar. There's no give command, so you have to select the use command from the menus and then press in the direction of the person you're giving it to. Except that didn't work here. You had to specifically sit opposite him at the table before you can give him the item. This is really counterintuitive. For one thing, you can't sit down, you just move over the same space the chair takes up. There's a gap between you where the table is, which means he's technically too far away to pass the item, but for some reason it works this one time. Maybe you're actually putting it on the table and then he grabs it. Later on you need to hand a blood staff to a priest. Should be nice and simple. I selected the blood staff, chose the use command and pressed in the direction of the priest. Except that didn't work. After trying many times and double checking that I was in fact using the correct staff, it turned out I had to use the item on myself to give it to him. It's this sort of thing that the remake could have probably sorted out. Also, to see if NPCs want to join your party, you have to go into combat mode against them, but then have every member of your party choose the hire command, which is kind of a convoluted way of doing it. One really old school feature that I liked was how you have conversations by typing in keywords. So if you wanted to ask Bobby about his lost dog, then you type dog or Rex to steer the conversation in that direction. The ability to type questions is retained for Wasteland 2, but is completely unnecessary there beyond some Easter eggs I think. Wasteland's story takes a while to get going. For the first half of the game you're just randomly exploring and helping people out, which eventually leads you to Las Vegas once you've fixed a broken engine. This is where the robots come into play and you start to uncover the details of Project Darwin. A man called Erwin Finster plus a pre-war artificial intelligence are working together to create machines and cyberhumans to take over the world. Like the Master from Fallout, Finster sees this as the natural evolution of humanity, wiping out the weak with a new race more adapted to the modern world. Working with an android called Max, you defeat Finster and then destroy the AI at base Cochise. It's a solid story, especially for a time when there was literally no room to include the story on the discs that contained the game. It's a shame the story gets interesting at the same time the combat becomes a chore. Up until Las Vegas you're following vague leads and doing chores for local groups. The overarching threat doesn't become clear until the final act, which is fine if you're still playing, but I was slowly losing my mind with the combat by that point. As we'll see, Wasteland 2 doesn't just follow on from the events of the main game, it even picks up a couple of side quests and carries them forward. In Wasteland, I'd wager the vast majority of players headed to Hypal and ended up killing Bobby's dog Rex because he's feral when he attacks you. Bobby then confronts you when you try to leave, and so you can either run or kill him. Most people probably did the latter. Well, you're absolutely going to face the consequences of that in the sequel. Likewise, most characters are brought forward. The starter team of Snake Vargas, Angela Death, Thrasher and Hellraiser are all in the sequel, with Vargas as the leader of the Desert Rangers, Death as an optional companion, Thrasher as an expert on the local geography, and Hellraiser as, well, a dead body you find. The first mission in Wasteland 2 tasks you with finding out who killed Ace, who is an optional companion from the first game that you could rescue from a hostage situation. I was continually amazed at how often the sequel rewarded me for having played Wasteland first, with smaller references as well, like people in the Ag Centre commenting on how Desert Rangers killed a crazy farmer called Harry years ago. It's a shame therefore that I can't really recommend you play Wasteland. Even though the remaster makes life a little easier, Wasteland can still be a miserable experience, and not just because you're in a post-nuclear wasteland. By the time I made it out of Las Vegas, I desperately wanted an easier difficulty option or the ability to turn off random encounters so that I could see the rest of the game without all the tedium that came with it. On the one hand, I think it's great that a modern remake is so faithful to the original that playing it probably does feel much like playing the original game. But on the other, I couldn't bring myself to finish it, and I can't imagine many people who didn't play it back in the day will bother either. The good news is that Wasteland 2 provides a lot of opportunities to get caught up on the events of Wasteland 1. If you so choose, you can get a huge info dump before you even leave the starting area, and if taking all that information in one go is a little too much, you can simply ask again later or casually explore the museum in the Ranger Citadel that contains artifacts from the first game. Lots of NPCs will tell you about Erwin Finster or the events at Base Cochise, and everyone in Hypel is more than happy to tell you how a group of Desert Rangers once showed up and killed Bobby and his dog. Overall, the continuation of the story is handled well, with the events of the first game being simple enough that you don't need to catch up on hundreds of years of history first, which is good because I suspect Wasteland 2 will be most people's first Wasteland game. Like the original game, Wasteland 2 doesn't mess around at the start and kind of throws you in at the deep end. The first thing you're asked to do is create a team of 4 Rangers. There are preset characters to choose from, but even so, this is quite daunting when you have no real idea what to expect from the rest of the game. I tend to get stuck on character selection screens at the best of times, and I worry about making bad builds. Wasteland 2 effectively multiplies that anxiety by 4. Messing up one character is bad, messing up a party of 4 could be a disaster. In a case of the master learning from the apprentice, Wasteland adopts the old school Fallout system for character creation. There are 7 attributes, a bunch of skills and some traits, plus perks as a bonus every 4 levels. The attributes are coordination, luck, awareness, strength, speed, intelligence and charisma. Most are self-explanatory except coordination, which is basically dexterity, and awareness, which is perception. inXile clearly wanted the attributes to spell out classic. Again, if you're going to copy, you might as well copy from the best. At first I thought the classic system was incredibly flawed, and maybe it is, however it does lead you down a path of specialisation, more so than most RPGs, and I think that's deliberate. The game definitely rewards you for having specialised squad members. Whether Classic was specifically designed to encourage this or if it was just a fortunate coincidence is debatable. There are 2 dump stats, luck and charisma, and one stat that is clearly the most important, intelligence. Charisma dictates whether your party can recruit new NPCs and works in tandem with the leadership skill, but beyond that it's largely useless. Luck is good for evading attacks, however other attributes like awareness and speed also provide evade buffs, so it's far from essential. Coordination is important for ranged attackers, so I loaded up my sniper with that, and strength is obviously for melee characters, so my brawler had a lot of points there. Awareness and speed aren't all that interesting. Your melee character needs to cover more ground, so speed is useful for them, while you might as well have some awareness for your sniper for the extra combat initiative. Then you just put as many points in intelligence as you can. This felt incredibly limiting at first, but like I said, you can create some incredibly specialised builds because you can bottom out luck and charisma and ignore either speed and strength or coordination and awareness depending on your choice of weapon. I don't think I've ever created a team of such min-maxed characters. However, maxing out the important attributes during character creation means the attributes are then boring for the rest of the game. You get a new attribute point every 10 levels, so you probably get 4 more during the course of the game, but I was never excited about spending them because I already had the points where I needed them. Thankfully, character creation is far more interesting when you get to skills. There are 29 in total, with a bonus one opening up near the end of the game, plus a weird Kickstarter-only backer bonus called Southwestern Folklore that gives you additional details on the world as you explore. Skills are split into combat, knowledge and general. You probably want every character to have a weapon skill, even if that isn't their primary role. I gave some characters proficiency in a second weapon type as a backup in case my sniper ran out of ammo or enemies got too close, but that never happened and those skill points were wasted. I continued with the aggressive min-maxing stance, and I had 2 out of the 4 characters be essentially useless in battle for a good third of the game, if not more. One character was a leader, with a leadership skill that stops companions going rogue and buffs the party's chance to hit, plus one of the 3 specific speech skills to talk us out of tricky situations. She also had a few nerdy skills like computer science and disarming alarms. In combat, her job was literally just to hang back and not get killed. She rarely even had a turn in combat, and when she did, she ran and hid. She was there to motivate others. My second ranger was the medic, and again he couldn't really fight. I gave him basic skill in bladed weapons and he chipped away at some enemies, but he wasn't a fighter. In addition to medic and surgeon skills, he could pick locks and open safes, so kind of a rogue cleric hybrid. My only two aggressive rangers were my sniper and brawler, which as you may have noticed means I didn't have anyone to cover the mid-range. Fortunately, you can recruit Angela Death early on and she is great with assault rifles. My sniper also acted as a weaponsmith and my brawler could break down walls and deactivate explosive traps, plus repair robots and machines. Toaster repair also returns from the first game, it's just another kind of lock picking really, although toasters are slightly more likely to contain items relevant to side quests it seems. Skills like lock picking and safe cracking work on a percentage system with the possibility for critical failures, so you can't just keep trying until you get it, unless you have a mechanical repair expert who can fix it for you to try again. The obvious drawback is that this is wide open to save scumming, but that's ultimately your choice. I think a better system would have been to make success guaranteed, but only if you were a certain level, e.g. this is a level 6 lock, so you need to be level 6 in lock picking, otherwise go away. However, I did manage to crack a few locks that were way above my level just by getting really lucky, and this was incredibly satisfying. The skill selection here is certainly better than that long list you got in the first Wasteland. There's no need to worry about being a specialist in fooling or bureaucracy this time. Every skill is useful more or less. The only problem is you aren't all that restricted in which ones you have. Most people will have a party of 7 and you can easily balance 4 skills per character, more for those with high intelligence. 4 multiplied by 7 is 28, so basically that's all the skills. Unless you know exactly who you're going to recruit and when, which you won't on the first playthrough, you'll likely get some skill overlap when you recruit someone who happens to be good at, say, the same speech skill you already have. But generally you can cover all your bases. This means there's not much point in replaying Wasteland 2. I missed a few toasters early on because that was one of the last things I decided to specialise in, and I didn't spend much time with shotguns or heavy weapons, but that is about it. I had all my bases covered, so I didn't really miss anything of note. I'm also disappointed by the implementation of some skills. There are 3 speech skills: hard ass, kiss ass or smart ass. During conversations you sometimes get the opportunity to use one or multiple of these to convince an NPC to reveal more information or back down from a fight. Thing is, it just feels like one charisma check spread out across 3 buttons. Smart ass is fun because you can point out the flaws in an NPC's argument, but the 3 options could easily be wrapped up into one general persuade skill. It's also a bit silly how these speech skills are independent from a character's attributes. Hard ass has nothing to do with the character's strength, kiss ass has nothing to do with charisma, and smart ass has nothing to do with intelligence. This leads to a problem that the Fallout games often have, which is that you can be very charismatic through speech skills without having any actual charisma. Conversely, you don't get to use any of the other skills during conversations. Being an expert in computer science or mechanical repair never opens up options related to science or engineering in conversations. This wouldn't be such a problem if those skills weren't so limited in their use otherwise. For a game that features cyborgs as a big part of the story, I expected to use computer science and mechanical repair quite often, and I made sure to be max level in both of these by the end. I was convinced they would come in use near the end game when I confronted an actual computer and a bunch of robots, but nope. They both feel a bit half-assed in their implementation. Computer science was often used to unlock safes that happened to have a digital lock instead of a physical one, and mechanical repair just helped me fix a few knackered engines, and that was about it. To be fair, you can use computer science to hack cyborgs during combat, which would have been quite useful if that skill hadn't been on my leader who had low combat initiative and speed. That's one thing I'd do differently if I played again. Weaponsmithing lets you add mods to weapons, but the mods are really boring, just your typical extra range and bigger magazines. It's somewhat unsatisfying to spend all those skill points getting your weaponsmithing up to level 10 and then only being able to add a slightly bigger magazine to your sniper rifle. Given the presence of cyborgs, why can't we add parts of dead machines to our guns? We could maybe have bullets with a chance to set enemies on fire, or add additional energy weapon options to regular pistols, that kind of thing. Mind you, the energy weapons are nowhere near as useful as I expected. They are best used against cyborg enemies or those with conductive armour, but there aren't enough of them to justify the specialisation. I took a companion on board specifically because she could use energy weapons, but found she was basically dead weight in most fights. Near the end of the game, you can unlock a skill called Combat Shooting. This is the one that was only included in the IBM PC version of the original Wasteland, where it did nothing. Well, it definitely serves a purpose in the sequel. If you find the skill book, you can pick one character to immediately rocket up to level 10 in this Combat Shooting skill, which means that every hit is a critical hit. The skill system is definitely more interesting than the attribute system. Whereas I didn't care about attributes much, I looked forward to spending new skill points every time I leveled up, and often noticed the differences immediately. Suddenly you have a good chance of disarming that alarm or opening that safe, which was previously impossible. Skills can easily override attribute shortfalls as well. Leadership provides such a huge buff to hit chance that a sniper can get by with below average coordination and still hit most of their shots. In another lesson from Fallout, Wasteland 2 has traits, which it calls quirks. I was pretty boring and didn't take any of them, but they weren't all that interesting. It's the usual mixture of buffs and nerfs, but they weren't especially fun, nor did they lead to any cool characters to roleplay as. Things like extra action points but less speed, or extra armour but less speed, or extra base damage but lower critical hit chance. I suppose this is one thing you could do on a repeat playthrough to mix things up a bit, and the random lightning strikes could be fun, otherwise it's a bit meh. Fallout's traits lend themselves a bit better to roleplaying, like Fast Shot, which meant each shot used one less action point, but you couldn't use VATS, which helped you play as a gunslinger character. Or there was Good Natured, which buffed non-combat skills in exchange for a nerf to weapon skills, which was great if you wanted to play less aggressively. Once you're out in the Wasteland, you earn perks every 4 levels. This system integrates nicely with the skills. There's a standard collection of perks available to everyone, like a boost to armour class, extra HP, carry capacity, that kind of thing. But the system comes into its own when you unlock new perks by upgrading your skills. This means as your sniper gets better at using sniper rifles, he unlocks access to perks like Watchman, which reduces the ambush penalty, and Zen Shooter, which stops him being put off by enemies nearby. The sniper perks were quite good, but other characters are left behind a bit. For example, lots of the perks for brawlers offered advantages for ambushing enemies, but you're more likely to use ambushes with ranged weapons because it's used to cover gaps that enemies might run through. It's not that you can never use an ambush with a melee character, it's just a lot less likely, and therefore those perks are less useful. I was also disappointed with the top level perks that were the last things to unlock in their respective categories. The last Outdoorsman perk reveals all caches and bonus shrines on the world map, but if your Outdoorsman skill is high, you're going to find these easily anyway. The Master Thief perk requires you to reach level 10 in both lockpicking and safe cracking, and means you don't get any critical failures when picking locks or cracking safes. That's definitely useful, but at that point, so late in the game, it might as well let you open every lock in just one try. Without the risk of a critical failure, you'll always be able to pick any lock if you try enough times. There's rarely, if ever, any time pressure on your lockpicking or the risk of getting caught, so it's kind of pointless to make you keep trying at, say, 13% odds or whatever it is. Anyway, now you're done with your team, at last. This process took me quite a while, which is why I made you listen to me talk about it for quite a while. You're welcome. Once you're done, you meet General Vargas, who tells you about Ace's murder, and you're sent off to install a bunch of repeaters on radios. Given that the worst part of Wasteland 1 was the combat, I am relieved to say that Wasteland 2's is much better, once again possibly using the early Fallout games as inspiration. There's an action point system for moving and attacking, it takes place on a grid, there are precision shots, percentages for hitting, which I swear regularly lie, plus a cover system. It's so similar to Fallout's original system that it would fit quite nicely into a remake of the first 2 games, hint hint Microsoft. The best thing about the combat for someone like me is that it's all so intuitive, and while I think it could do with a little more depth, which I'll discuss later, it's largely easy to grasp while still offering plenty of opportunities to express yourself tactically. In my video on Divinity Original Sin, I spoke at length about how I enjoyed the combat system there, and all the options it provided, but I must admit it can be nice to play something a little more straightforward as well. There's no need to mess around with spell ranges and area of effect stuff. The weapon types in Wasteland 2 are obvious enough that anyone who's played a video game with guns in it will have an immediate grasp on what to use and when. The guns all sound great as well. Sniper rifles pack a loud punch, energy weapons have a bassy thwum to them, and bladed weapons hack into flesh with a satisfying mushy noise. In another contrast to Divinity Original Sin, I also appreciated the lack of weapon choice and variation in Wasteland 2. You occasionally need to consider whether you want a gun with, say, larger ammo capacity but with less damage, but for the most part it's clear when a new weapon represents a clear progression on the last one. There's not a ton of loot here, you don't need to think about what gun each character has all the time. If you've specialised in sniper rifles and the anti-material rifle becomes available, then yeah, you absolutely should replace the SVD. Better guns often require rarer and more expensive forms of ammo as well, so just when you're getting comfortable with your supply of say 38 caliber bullets, you have to switch to 45s and build up your stock again. The UI is impressive, clearly showing you not only where you can move with each character within a turn, but how far you can move while still getting an attack in with the available action points. I relied on this so much that it tripped me up a bit when it stopped working for my snipers. There's a perk you can get in the sniper rifle tree which makes shots take one less action point if you don't move. Obviously if you have 12 action points and one shot takes 7 action points reduced to 6, this perk is the difference between being able to take 2 shots per round instead of 1. Unfortunately the game tells you where you can move based on the amount of action points it takes to shoot before moving. Moving means the perk is no longer active and adds 1 action point to the amount required to shoot. A few times I moved and then realised I didn't have enough points to shoot that round, which was a waste. That's a pretty minor problem though, everything else is straightforward. Precision attacks aren't that useful early on because the odds of actually hitting are so low that you probably won't bother. I ended up going most of the game without them, although they are useful near the end, especially when fighting machines, because you can target parts of its systems to disable shields. There isn't much in the way of buffs or nerfs to worry about during combat except the enhanced aim accuracy that comes with the leadership skill. This is again quite nice because all you need is someone with medic and surgeon skills to heal and pick people up when they go down. You might need to heal bleeding as well, but that's about it. I didn't need to carry around 20 or 30 potion types to counter every single eventuality. Wasteland 2 lets you have a party of up to 7, which is big enough as it is, but you can also have hangers-on. These are people you can't control during combat but who help you out anyway. My favourite was Vax, a cyborg who you create during the events of the first game. If you ever wondered what happened to him after that, well now you know. He ended up in a container at an abandoned railway. You can repair him and even overclock him with mechanical repair and computer science skills, and he followed me around for ages. I'm pretty sure you're only supposed to use him for the one fight near where you find him. This was my first time fighting the large slicer dicers and it was a tough battle so early in the game. Vax can make life a lot easier here. Of course I didn't find Vax until after the long fight with the slicer dicers. Vax packs a huge punch. He often wiped out 2 enemies per turn with his energy blast and he makes everyone else's efforts look rather feeble. Unfortunately, Vax never concerned himself with things like friendly fire, so some fights started with me making sure all my characters were out of his firing line before he took his turn. Vax has very little health and it's tough to keep him alive. You can keep repairing him after he takes damage, but hangers-on can't be revived after being knocked down in combat. When they're dead, they're dead. It got to the stage where one hit would kill him and he went down in a glorious battle to save a young girl from being turned into a cyber being. It was a glorious and fitting way to go out. I recruited a young mutant called Night Terror, who is again from the first game. I believe he can attack, but he never did once during my playthrough, and I kept him right until the end of the game. He has a whopping 8,000 XP, so he's basically a sponge to absorb attacks that would otherwise have been targeted at your party. There was also this weird priest guy who walked around muttering Latin phrases. He would hang around for a bit, then disappear, then show up again later. For one brief moment I had 4 of these hangers on, making for a total party size of 11, but more typically you'll only have 1 or 2. Right at the end for the final boss battle there was an entire army. This was brilliant. You can ask all the people you helped along the way to join you, and even though they died quickly, they definitely helped. This final series of battles really felt like a group effort, and it was incredible to attack the final base alongside the likes of General Vargas, who I spent all that time with in Wasteland 1. Every single person who went into battle with me at the end died, and so did one of my team. We barely made it out of there alive, but we saved the Wasteland together. A happy and slightly dark ending. As you can tell, I liked Wasteland 2's combat system. Its simplicity was one of its greatest assets, but I must admit it could have done with a touch more depth. The environment doesn't play as much of a role as I'd have liked. The first half of the game takes place in Arizona, and there are a few opportunities to take high ground which enemies can use to their advantage as well. But in the second half, just when you're looking for more depth to the combat, you move to California where everything is much flatter and height is a non-issue. Some cover is destructible, although I found it hard to tell exactly what could be blown apart and what couldn't, and sometimes enemies would shoot me through gaps in the wall that I assumed I was hidden behind. There also aren't many opportunities to use the environment to your advantage by blowing up barrels and the like. Finally, while you can split your team apart to spread out for a tactical ambush, this is more awkward than it should be. Enemy range of vision is inconsistent and you can't actually hide behind cover before combat officially starts, you just kind of stand by it. As a result, I would only split my party up and surround enemies when they were neutral towards me and let me walk around freely, up until the point I shot at them of course. The main problem with combat though is simply one of repetition. The vast majority of fights are against human raider type enemies in groups of about 6 to 9, and fighting machines or animals doesn't mix things up as much as you might expect. Every fight went much the same way. I would bring my party in range of the enemies, and before officially starting combat, my best sniper would shoot at and often kill the most threatening enemy in range. I usually try to get rid of the enemy sniper if they had one. Combat then goes turn-based, and because my sniper has high initiative, he goes first, and he would either finish off the guy he just shot at or attack someone else. The enemy could be 2 down before even getting to move. They then spend an entire turn getting people into range for attacks, and then it's my go again. Most groups just didn't stand a chance. It's no coincidence that the fights which mix things up a bit are the most memorable and challenging. When trying to save the girl from being converted to a cyborg, the only way to save her life was to cut the connection between the main cyborg and the girl. I couldn't just kill the leader because she'd send the kill code to the young girl. I had to shut down the network during combat. There were also some fun enemy types like suicide monks who rush at you with a nuclear grenade if you threaten the people they're supposed to be protecting, and the disco robots that distract you with funky tunes and sparkling lights. Another negative is that Wasteland 2 is probably too easy for experienced players. I consider myself pretty bad at strategy games, and I found the medium difficulty setting to be a complete cakewalk. I had so many med packs on hand it was embarrassing, and I could buy anything I wanted. Things weren't much harder even one level up, so I can only imagine that people more adept at this kind of thing would sleepwalk through all the fights. The random encounters that I hated so much in the first Wasteland game have largely been removed, but you can still get stuck in a fight while wandering the world map. A good outdoorsman's skill helps you run from such encounters, and even if you do have to fight you can at least get the jump on them. If your outdoorsman's skill is low, then expect to be the ones getting ambushed all the time. It says a lot about Wasteland 2 that I can honestly say I enjoyed random encounters that led to turn-based combat. I'm not sure what higher praise I can offer. Wasteland 2's combat blows that of the original Fallout games out of the water, but that's not difficult. What's more remarkable is how Wasteland 2 excels at creating a depressing post-apocalyptic atmosphere that matches or even exceeds that of the original Fallout games. Wasteland 2 doesn't have the kitschy 50s retro style with the infamous caps or Vault Boy. However, given how those things have been handled in recent years, that could be seen as a good thing. Okay, I know it's fashionable to hate on Fallout now, so I'll say that I do like the iconography from that series and I don't want it to go away. A Fallout game without the Pip-Boy and caps wouldn't be a Fallout game. But that said, it's nice to play a game set in a post-apocalyptic nuclear wasteland that still treats nuclear weapons as a bad thing that you probably shouldn't mess around with. My favourite feature is probably the radio. It doesn't play jaunty retro music, it simply keeps you informed about what's happening with your team back at base and in the immediate world around you. Okay, music does pop up on the radio sometimes, and when it does it's really creepy.
Hey! Over there! You guys!
While exploring the wasteland, you pick up cries for help from nearby citizens, which puts new locations on your map. I know this seems like standard fare these days, but it is how the Rangers actually operate, so it feels less gamey here. Most of the main missions are about repairing radio towers, in part so that you can spread the word of the Desert Rangers and answer more calls for help. That is what they do. While helping out with a problem at Highpool, I had to listen on the radio as Ag Centre begged for assistance. The Rangers at the base kept promising that help was on the way, but I couldn't get there quick enough, and in the end they said we might as well not bother. I loved using the radio to call base every time I was ready to level up, or be promoted as the game refers to it. You would think after levelling up 40 times it would get boring, but I found it far more satisfying to radio in for a promotion than just automatically be awarded more skill points. You also have a little typewriter in the corner which keeps a record of conversations and describes the nearby environment. Most CRPGs have a similar log, but I love the look and sounds this one makes as it updates. The importance of old technology like radios and typewriters keeps everything appropriately grounded. There's one great scene where Angela Death radios back to base from a helicopter as she approaches California and ultimately crashes. You stand there for quite some time doing nothing except listening to Death and Vargas speak on the radio, and yet it's surprisingly engaging. I'm sure other games would have knocked up a quick cutscene to show the crash, but being forced to listen to it all via radio reminds you of how helpless you are and how crucial an old technology like a radio is in this world. Even the fairly plain overworld map manages to stay in the spirit of things. You need to keep your water topped off by filling it up at pumps, which most towns have, and maybe stopping at any oasis spots you find. There are so many water spots you'll have a job to run out, but it's a nice touch carried forward from the original, and it serves to emphasise how precious water is in Arizona. The water meter disappears once you reach California. The atmosphere also comes through in the visuals. Obviously I'm not talking about strict graphical fidelity here. Character models look especially rough when you zoom in too close, and there are some bizarrely flat textures in places. What I appreciate is the attention to detail and making the world as believable as possible. Most environments are packed full of little details, except when they're supposed to be barren wastelands of course. There's the usual abandoned cars and ruined buildings that are par for the course in this setting, but there's so much more if you pay attention. I particularly loved how the children had drawn games of hopscotch on the ground, which is something I actually noticed happening around me in the real world during the early days of the lockdown. Each town feels lived in and has a clear food and water source, and unfortunately there's nearly always a full graveyard too. I would have loved to have looked around more, however the camera can be absolutely terrible and it always goes through scenery. Arizona and California are distinctive regions. Arizona is obviously dry and rustic, whereas California has overgrowth everywhere. Generally, California is doing better than Arizona. The people of California have started to open up shops and cafes in Hollywood or live out of places like Angel Oracle, which is what's left of the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. Conversely, Arizona has so little going for it that entire towns will spring up around a couple of abandoned trains. Really, my only criticism of Wasteland 2's world is that it is almost too accurate a representation of the wasteland. Having large abandoned stretches of desert is appropriate, but it also makes for a lot of time spent wandering around empty maps. There's no fast travel, which is broadly a good thing, but it does mean you have to sit there and wait while your party slowly makes its way back to the entrance of each area whenever you want to go somewhere else. I still think that not having a distinctive style and iconography can be a positive thing, and it makes for a refreshing change. However, I can't deny that it also makes the overall experience slightly less memorable. A part of me wishes Wasteland had its own unique style, something that you could see on merchandise, as tacky as that sounds. It's not like Wasteland is too self-serious to have that, it already breaks the fourth wall a lot. You can find copies of Wasteland on floppy disks, and the computer hints at an upcoming Wasteland 3. There's a cache of abandoned ET cartridges and a clear reference to the famous burial of the Atari 2600 game. An item called Computer Chip 13 is presumably a reference to Fallout's water chip. Even the first game did this silly stuff a bit, with the mayor of Las Vegas being named Farron Brygo. Wasteland 2 handles this stuff well because most of the Easter eggs are historical references and not pop culture gags, which was a trap Fallout 2 fell into quite a bit. Wasteland 2's references won't date anywhere near as badly as, say, nods to Austin Powers for example. I wouldn't mind a little more character though. Let's face it, even the desert rangers themselves are kinda dull. They're not unlike the Minutemen for example, and I half expected Vargas to say another settlement needs your help. This is undoubtedly a harsh criticism, and arguably not a fair one, but it's worth considering why Fallout has had such a big cultural impact compared to Wasteland. Sure, part of it is timing and regular releases, but Wasteland 2 has been out for 6 years now, and while it did well, it doesn't get talked about as much as it should. Fallout has had a rough 5 years to say the least, and yet Wasteland hasn't jumped in to fill that gap. Maybe having a little extra spark wouldn't do any harm. That could certainly apply to the main story. Wasteland 2's story starts off in what is fast becoming familiar ground for modern CRPGs. As with Shadowrun Returns and Divinity Original Sin, your first quest is to solve a murder. The cool twist here is that people who played the first game will likely care about the victim, Ace, who was a recruitable companion and a useful one. For those people, this gives the story a bit more added impetus than the first game, which just sent you out into the wasteland to help people, although ultimately that is still what you do. In fact, 2 of the early locations here are High Pool and Ag Centre, which are likely the first places you went in the original game. Given how small those locations were then, they don't look much alike in the sequel, although it's cool to revisit the exact same room where you repaired the engine all those years ago. Ace was killed by a synth, and his death is linked to a mysterious radio message which talks about a new future for humanity. The first half of the game is spent installing radio repeaters to track the message, which leads you to California. In LA, you discover that a man called Matthias is working with an AI to turn everyone into cyborgs and take over humanity. If this sounds familiar, well, yeah, it's basically the same story as Wasteland 1, and not a million miles from that of Fallout 1 either if you've replaced cyborgs with mutants. In fact, Matthias was one of the Guardians the Rangers defeated in Wasteland 1, which is why he's so keen to destroy the Rangers. And the AI is the same AI that was seemingly defeated at Base Cochise. It managed to install a copy of itself at the Rangers Citadel and has been there right under the Rangers' noses the entire time. The Rangers confront Matthias and the AI at their base. Matthias is easy enough to kill, although the synths put up a fight. The AI can be left alive if you run away after the battle is over. This gets you a bad ending where the AI source code spreads and synths destroy humanity. You're supposed to pick up on clues about a nuclear weapon in the base and select somebody to stay behind and detonate it. I wouldn't blame anyone for missing this because after the final fight, the AI just sort of rambles on aimlessly for ages. I got bored and started exploring. Before I knew it, I was bailing out on a helicopter and leaving the AI to its own business. Oops. The story has more in common with Wasteland 1 than just the main story beats. As with the original, the Wasteland 2 story doesn't really kick into gear until near the end. You spend a good 2/3 of your time just helping locals and resolving disputes between factions. You don't meet Matthias until the end. You can speak to him briefly over a terminal in Hollywood, but he doesn't make much of an impression. Matthias and his little gang end up feeling like just another faction, and by the time you get to him you've fought a bunch of them already. You can actually join Matthias when you speak to him over the terminal. If you do, he asks you to slaughter a few rival groups to prove your loyalty and rewards you by blowing you up. Even if I was role-playing as an evil group, Matthias's offer wouldn't be especially tempting after such a brief conversation. Unfortunately, there doesn't appear to be much freedom when you confront him at the end. I even tried surrendering and volunteering to be assimilated, but this still started a fight. There's certainly no cool way to talk him down as with the famous master conversation at the end of Fallout 1. Given how epic that moment is, I'm really surprised more games don't try and copy it by, for example, giving us the chance to prove to Matthias that the AI is going to betray him. The equivalent was never an easy thing to do in Fallout and required finding certain pieces of evidence and then having conversations with NPCs about it, but having the possibility be there makes a huge difference. One thing Wasteland 2 nails is the ending slides, which cover the consequences of basically every choice you made, large and small. There's wording to reflect really minor and specific choices like whether you gave kids cigarettes in High Pool. Finally, Wasteland 2 does a great job in its treatment of the old crew. Vargas is in charge, but he's not seen as a hero by all. Many think he's too weak and want him to be more aggressive in conflicts with other groups, such as the Red Scorpion Militia. If you still have Vargas with you right at the end, then he can be the one to stay behind and blow up the nuke. I hope this is the canon ending because it's a fitting send-off for the man who gave most of his life to the Rangers. Hellraiser is found dead during the game, and Angela Death can be a companion until she goes off chasing a lead and seemingly dies, although her body is never found. It's a shame the new companions don't get much love. There are no companion questlines, nor much information to be gleaned from them after the initial conversation you had when you recruited them. They do appear to have distinctive personalities from the vague snippets of dialogue we get, but there's no opportunity to explore them further. With the story not really kicking into gear until the last act, most of your time in Wasteland 2 is spent doing side quests and resolving disputes between factions. Most towns you visit have some kind of internal strife, and you can choose a side to work with or try to come up with a solution that pleases everyone. The quality of these side stories is inconsistent. The big choice you have to make early on is whether to save High Pool or Ag Centre. Both are under attack and urgently need your help. You can't save both though. High Pool is the region's main source of water, and Ag Centre is the main source of food. I chose to save Highpool because the Desert Rangers really owe them one. As you might remember, Highpool was the place in the first game where we killed Bobby's dog and later Bobby himself. If you don't remember that, the locals will certainly remind you every chance they get.
Well, let me fill you in. 15 years ago, you fuckers came out here and shot a little orphan boy's dog. And then you shot the little orphan boy, my nephew Bobby.
You can even visit Rex's grave and dig up Bobby's grave if you're so inclined. If you do, you'll find it empty. After saving the town from a raider attack and helping to fix the water pumps, the Desert Rangers get back in everyone's good graces and help elect a new mayor. All the while, Ag Center is attacked by a race of mutated plants after a doctor sabotaged the nutrient supply system. You can still go to Ag Center and kill the mutated plants, but their radio was damaged beyond repair in the chaos and everyone is dead. If you choose to save Ag Center over Highpool, then it's Highpool's radio that's the one that gets destroyed. I'm slightly surprised the game presents you with such a big choice so early on. You don't know much about either town, so your choice is going to be somewhat random, unless you feel you owe a debt to Highpool from Wasteland 1. It might have been slightly better to send the player to both locations first, so that they can meet the locals and do a quest or two, and then present them with the choice. That way you'll know exactly who you're helping and who you're letting down. The choice is harder and the guilt at leaving one town to die is more impactful. The consequences around Bobby and his dog reverberate throughout much of the first half of the game. There's a gang in the area calling themselves the Red Scorpion Militia, or RSM, who put themselves forward as an improvement upon the Desert Rangers. The Mayor of Highpool is even thinking of switching over to them for protection because the Desert Rangers have been so useless lately, plus the whole dog thing. However, the RSM contains a lot of rogue elements who've been attacking towns and effectively enslaving citizens. Technically, the people are paid for their work, but not in the usual currency of scrap, but rather the Scorpion scrip, which can only be spent at specially designated stores. The leader of the RSM is protected by practically invincible turrets, and the game not so subtly tells you that you can't make it past these turrets until you're stronger. I don't like this artificial roadblock here, especially because it's not actually a case of getting stronger at all. You either need to fix a robot for the RSM, or near the end of the first half the game randomly tells you to try going back to the prison, and sure enough, once there you can get past the turrets by promising the leader you can cure his sick dogs. It's pretty contrived. The leader really loves dogs, and has done ever since he was young when a group of Desert Rangers killed his beloved Rex. Yeah, the leader is actually Bobby. He survived the fight with the Rangers 15 years ago and dug his way out of his grave after being buried alive. He then built up his own militia with the goal of eventually destroying the Desert Rangers. Despite him being in charge, Bobby claims that the whole enslavement thing has nothing to do with him and is a consequence of some rogue generals. Given that we tried to kill him as a child, we can't really claim much moral high ground here. I let him live on the promise that he would reform the RSM. When I played Wasteland 1, I had no idea Bobby and his dog were going to become such an important part of Wasteland 2, both in terms of Bobby's own story and how your group of rangers is treated by others. Even outside of Highpool, people know the story of the arseholes who rocked up one day, killed a boy's dog and then killed the boy on their way out. In the moment though, this felt like a small side quest. Bobby's lost dog was just one of the many quest hints on a notice board in the shop. There was no way to know the whole thing would spiral out of control with the effects still felt 15 in-game years later. After you've dealt with either Highpool or Ag Center, you push forward into new towns, either because you need to use their radio tower or simply because they're blocking the way forward, like Titan Canyon that you need to pass through to get to Demonta. Most locations repeat a familiar story. There are two squabbling groups and you should choose who to help or maybe get them both to reach a peaceful solution. It does get a little repetitive and it's basically a trope for CRPGs these days, but that doesn't mean it's always boring. The fight for control over the railways between Topekas and Atchisons is pretty good. Both groups need something the other has to get the trains up and running, but both refuse to compromise. What I liked about this quest was how human the resolution felt. While neither group has clean hands, the Atchisons are clearly the worst of the two. They leave landmines everywhere and even place a bomb on a child's bicycle so that it detonates if moved. The best solution is clearly to have everyone agree to stop fighting, and you can arrange that by bouncing back and forth between both camps and completing a few chores. However, even after doing all this, Kekabar, the leader of the Topekans, admits that he doesn't like the idea of the Atchisons getting away with everything they've done. Peace is all well and good, but surely they should face the consequences. Kekabar lost his arm in a train accident, so he demands that the leader of the Atchisons cut off his own arm if the peace deal was to go through. This demand can wreck the entire peace agreement, but people can be spiteful like that, and it's only human to want revenge or reparations against those who have harmed you. Another entertaining squabble was the Manorites versus the Robinsons in Angel Oracle. As their name suggests, the Manorites believe in good manners above all else, and will take extreme measures to punish those who break the rules. The Robinsons don't. The contrast between the two groups forced to live together can be quite amusing, like when a Robinson and a Manorite are considering hooking up. The Robinson is just upfront about what they want, and the Manorite has to talk around it because, I guess, sex is rude. The quest does unfortunately have the post-apocalyptic wasteland cliche of having one group be cannibals, because of course they are. The dispute between Heidi's Hollywood gang and the church was also quite interesting because both groups were equally vile. Heidi permitted slavery in the city and was running a drug ring, while the church also had slaves and an armed militia that it didn't hesitate to use. Neither is worthy of your help, so first you need to organise a coup of both groups. McDade at the church happens to be in love with Veronica, a sex worker for Heidi, and you can arrange it for them both to take charge of their respective groups and then make peace. McDade is an interesting character. He tortures people at the church but goes to Veronica to be tortured in his spare time. On a less positive note, the faction war in the canyon is really dull. Both groups want control of a nuclear weapon, but it turns out the missile is fake. The real one is in another base. You can send the missile to either group or just deactivate it if you have a high enough demolition or mechanical repair skill, which I fortunately did. The Diamondbacks are the good guys here, taking on a kind of freedom fighter role versus the Mad Monks, but they still suck. My rule is that anyone who wants a nuke probably shouldn't have a nuke. Wasteland 2 is split evenly between Arizona and California, and people often have a strong preference for one or the other. I've seen some complain that the game falls apart after you leave Arizona, while others say Arizona is too slow and the game doesn't pick up until you reach California. Personally, I feel like both sides are fairly even. Arizona is more depressing, whereas California is in slightly better shape, but the quests are largely of high quality in both, and I like how grounded your overall mission is. In Arizona, your goal is simply to install 3 repeaters on 3 radio stations. You find one right away and quickly get the second in Highport or Ag Center, depending on which one you help. After that, you have to make your way to DeMonta, which involves finding where it is first of all, and then heading through the canyon. California has optional missions to install radio repeaters, but your main goal is to find the materials to make better rad suits to get through the radiation zones. This means most of your time is spent trying to find cat litter, which apparently is great for soaking up rads. I love that this is what Wasteland 2 makes you do. The last CRPG I played was Divinity Original Sin, which had me hunting bloodstones before fighting the Void for the future of the universe. Wasteland 2 makes me find cat litter. The only major letdown in California was a few boring quests that killed the pace and maybe some missed opportunities as well. When you first arrive in California, your goal is to mend some fences. Not metaphorical ones, literal fences. There are 5 broken sections of fence, each with a few beasties around to kill first. This felt like it could have been the very first quest of the game, not one halfway through. California also has a section where you need to complete the Gauntlet of Samson. This gets built up as a big event to see if you're worthy of joining the church. Plenty of people die trying to run the gauntlet. I had it built up in my head as something akin to a dungeon with a mixture of puzzles and combat that would put all my abilities to the test. Instead, I fought a load of wolves, toads and badgers, most of which blew themselves up on landmines as they ran towards me. This area feels like it should be so much more, and I have to wonder whether it was cut down for time. If there's one thing missing from Wasteland 2 that its predecessor had, it's more puzzles. It's rarely hard to figure out what you have to do in the sequel. You probably know what it is you need to get and where to find it, and the challenge is in picking the lock or repairing the toaster or defeating the enemies. The first game was tougher. You had to figure out where to dig by following instructions, make notes of passwords from the environment, use ropes to cross rivers or chasms and find hidden entrances. You still do a lot of digging. One of my characters had to have a shovel in her inventory from the beginning to the end of the game. It's just that you're only ever doing it for slightly more loot, and the dig sites reveal themselves when you're nearby. The closest I got to a good hidden password was when I stole a book belonging to the son of the town mayor, and he had marked up some pages in a suspicious way. Nothing is really hidden in Wasteland 2, except perhaps an obscure passcode to an optional area that you can only get by exploring the museum way back at Ranger Base. That was pretty obscure. Otherwise, all possible entrance points show up when you hold down the reveal button. I suppose that's partly a consequence of more realistic looking worlds. You can't hide doors or dig spots in the same way you could in Wasteland 1. You can't give someone a clue to find buried treasure based on taking a certain number of steps, because the characters don't move one tile at a time anymore. I still think it's borderline miraculous that Wasteland 2 exists, and I'm incredibly grateful for it. I'm even more grateful that it exists in this form. An interesting CRPG with solid combat and an appropriately wretched world that incorporates not just the main events of the first game, but many of the smaller adventures the team had along the way. Wasteland 2's major problem is that it doesn't excel in any one area, and as such there isn't much to get excited about. However, in many ways that's quite fitting. It's not an exciting game because it's not an exciting world. Excitement isn't everything, although I guess someone with a voice as boring as mine would say that. Having become increasingly frustrated with Fallout games over the last 5 years, I found it a nice change of pace to play a post-apocalyptic game that doesn't go to such extremes as having players launch nukes for the lulz. That said, there is a cool mystery around some red buttons. You can press one in a sewer, but it doesn't do anything obvious until you go back to the main map and find the new location of Irvine highlighted. Once in Irvine there's another red button, and this time after pressing it a man called Aaron Chawat tells you you've doomed everyone. Turns out Aaron Chawat is the birth name of a real-life American actor called Red Buttons. As for what inspired the developers to put him in the game, I don't know, but I love that they did. Alright, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like, subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know what you thought in the comments. If you would like to go the extra mile and support me on Patreon, you can get your name in the credits and a Patreon role in my Discord server for $1 a month. My next video will likely be a critique of Deus Ex Human Revolution, probably followed by Dead Space 3. I obviously want to do a video on Cyberpunk 2077, but I don't know the timing on that one because I've no idea how long the game is for a start. As for this specific series on the history of isometric CRPGs, the next game covered is probably going to be the Age of Decadence. My suspicion is that that will be January's video. Okay, until next time, cheers.